The approaches that I've discussed so far share one big assumption: that media matter, that propaganda changes people's minds, that the meanings of messages that media producers broadcast are the same as the meanings that audiences receive. So far, all the thinkers we've talked about have kind of assumed that media are effective. And it's not just Marxian theorists who have this problem, this big assumption on which their ideas are based. When we talk about media in everyday life, especially in a political context, I think that it's easy, maybe too easy, to adopt what some scholars call the hypodermic needle model of media reception. That is, we kind of fall back on assuming that when a news channel or a politician or a teacher says something or shows an image, their message, that image gets kind of injected intact and unchanged directly into our brains, the brains of their audiences, who now think what the channel or politician or teacher wants them to think. But that's not necessarily the case. I'm sure you can think of plenty of examples from your own life when you saw a news story but didn't believe it, read maybe an opinion article that made you double down on the opposite argument than that opinion writer was advocating. You can think of times when you've viewed an advertisement that turned you off the product instead of making you want to buy it. So the questions to guide this lecture are: when, why, and how do media actually have effects, intended or otherwise? A connected question is: what is the relationship among, one, an event in the world, two, the producer of a message about that event, three, the message itself, and finally, four, the consumer of that message, the audience? The first thinker that I want to discuss who gets at some of these questions is Stuart Hall, who was a Jamaican and British sociologist, and in the second half of the 20th century was a founding figure in the field of cultural studies. For Hall, the study of culture wasn't just about cataloging rituals or folktales or ethnic styles of dress. Really, to study culture was to study very broadly how we all make sense of the world, which is always deeply political and always contested. Hall was interested in the never-ending cultural conflicts over how we should make sense of this or that event, this or that person or image. Now, Hall, like all the scholars I'm discussing, really didn't buy into what we might call the naive realist or naive empiricist assumption about communication. According to the naive empiricist, what a representation of the world does or is supposed to do, whether it's produced by a scientist or a journalist or a politician or a teacher, what a representation is supposed to do is take some reality about the world that we perceive, either directly, like with our senses, or using tools like statistics and experiments, and then translate those facts, those truths about the world into a message. And when a message deviates from reality, its producer then is either kind of mistaken or a liar in the naive empiricist view. Naive empiricism corresponds nicely to the hypodermic needle model of the media, right? So according to this thinking, with language, with media of some kind, you're kind of sticking a needle into the world, drawing a bit of that world out into your syringe, and then injecting it into the brain of whoever you're talking with, or showing a representation of that part of the world, that sample of the world. And then for empiricist researchers, the job of media studies is kind of more limited. The job of media studies is to call out misrepresentations and fake news. And the way you do this is you take an objective measurement of reality, which you're somehow able to do, and then you calculate the distance between a particular news outlet's or films or politicians' claim and what actually is the ultimate reality. With the thinking, right, that there's just one reality, one truth that is accessible if you're just objective enough and careful enough. So this is the work that fact checkers do, for example, and it's certainly important work. But the problem that Stuart Hall identified with this naive realist approach is that it assumes, again, that kind of direct objective observation of the world is actually possible. This idea that we can really just look closely and set aside our biases in order to directly access some ultimate and singular truth about the world without any illusions or any subjectivity interfering is one that Hall rejects. So he argues instead that our access to the world and to events that occur in the world are always indirect, always mediated through language, through code, through the media in the very broad sense in which I've been using the term. One of the main ways in which we make sense of the world is by classifying objects and happenings according to concepts and labels that we carry around in our head and that are culturally received, right? That we learn from school, from friends and family, from watching TV. We learn from all those people and institutions what things mean and how some things are connected to other things in the world. So let's say I'm walking into my office when I step on something, a piece of cardboard. Drawn on that piece of cardboard is a picture of the globe and the words "end climate change" in all caps. Now, okay, there really is an object under my foot, that's real, but to make sense of that object, of what it means, there's cultural decoding work to be done. In my mind, I connect this piece of cardboard to all sorts of other stuff that I've learned about humans' impact on the environment, but also about what a political demonstration is, what it means to participate in democracy, and also all kinds of things that I've learned about what sort of people write "end climate change" on a piece of cardboard, and whether they're my friends or my enemies. And so my interpretation of the sign, the meaning that I draw from it, would change if I lacked the background information or if I had different pre-existing understandings of environmentalism, of democracy, and so on. I might decode the message in a way that's very different from what the original creator intended when they encoded their message in the medium of a cardboard sign, right? When they wrote the words "end climate change." And let's say I don't stop at just reading the sign, but I take a photo of it and post it on social media. I've now recorded the message into a new form and gone from consumer to producer. And now there's a whole new round of interpretation and decoding that's going to occur. So let's say my post on social media gets 2 comments. One from a friend who takes the meaning of the photograph, which is right of an abandoned sign on the sidewalk, to be that the beleaguered environmentalist movement is doomed. That's the message that they take away from this. And they also take away the message that the sign maker was maybe a hypocrite because they themselves littered by dropping that sign on the street and so contributed to environmental degradation. And then let's say the second comment that I received to my post on social media is from a flat earther who says, really there should be ice walls drawn around the edge of the picture of the globe to make it more accurate. Right? That's the big takeaway that they got from the message or the intervention that they made. And so just the way the meaning of the original cardboard sign was not kind of self-contained, right? Part of its meaning came from what I added to it as a viewer. The meaning of those written comments on my photo and the meaning of the photo also that I posted on Facebook or wherever, none of these meanings are kind of fixed or self-contained. The meaning changes as the object moves from one context to another and as different consumers, different people come in and decode it and interpret it in their own ways. And this meaning is always continually changing, right? If a historian 100 years from now is researching environmentalism in the early 21st century and reads those same comments, the meaning is going to change once again because that researcher has a different perspective, they're coming from a different context and from a different culture. And so they'll inevitably draw a different meaning from the same sign and contextualize in a different way. For example, with the hindsight of what actually happened to the world in the late 21st century and also the context of all the environmentalism that came after us. And so it's not the case that one of these interpretations is necessarily truer in one ultimate sense than the others. Well, I mean, okay, so the flat earther is just empirically wrong. The earth isn't flat, it isn't surrounded by ice walls. So we're not rejecting altogether the idea that like all representations and interpretations are equally valid. We're not saying that fact-checking is useless. That's not the point. But what we are saying is that the meaning of an image or a comment depends on both the producer and the consumer of media, both the speaker and the listener, right? And sometimes the listener decodes a message the way that the speaker intended them to, but sometimes the listener takes away a very different meaning. So propaganda doesn't always work. Sometimes media consumers do what Hall calls oppositional decoding, meaning that they interpret the signals transmitted to them in ways that go against the intentions and also against the interests of the sender of the message, the media producer. Oppositional decoding is happening kind of all the time. It isn't inherently, I think, good or bad. So it's oppositional decoding when, for example, TV watchers in Egypt don't believe the state TV broadcast about pro-democracy protesters being terrorists and criminals. So if TV watchers in Egypt are taking negative news, negative representations of the protest to be actually like a good sign that, wow, the protesters really have this corrupt government of ours worried, that's oppositional decoding. But it's also oppositional decoding, for example, when German neo-Nazis think that the mainstream media is too sympathetic toward refugees. Both of these are examples of oppositional decoding, right? That goes against the intention of what the original producer of a message was trying to say. Now, what does often happen is that one particular meaning often does become the dominant one, the dominant meaning. And so there's kind of an alignment that occurs in the meaning of what the speaker thinks they're saying and what the listener understands. And there has to be some basic cultural alignment in place between you and I for you to even make sense of what I'm saying. We must be kind of speaking the same language in both Hall's sense of language and in the colloquial sense. We have to be speaking the same language to some extent in order to even understand each other. But what happens is sometimes one specific meaning does become so dominant that it becomes naturalized. And this happens all the time with language, again, in the colloquial sense. So when I see the word cow, C-O-W, written down, I don't really question what the author means. I can kind of assume that we're on the same page, right? That the letters C-O-W can stand in as a symbol for that animal grazing out there in the field. It's probably not too big of a problem that I adopt this kind of uncritical, naturalized position toward the word cow, right? But according to Stuart Hall, for politically loaded words, images, messages of all kinds, naturalization can actually be kind of a mechanism through which hegemonic power operates. And in this sense, Hall is very much kind of a student of or continuing the intellectual legacy of Marx and then Antonio Gramsci and Gramsci's work on hegemony. If you're a powerful elite or a powerful faction and you can get everyone else to adopt your definitions, your preferred associations between images, between signs and meaning, then you can essentially control public opinion. So, for example, the word freedom can mean lots of different things. And so there's always kind of different interpretations of freedom. There's always a struggle over how to define it, and a struggle also to naturalize the definition of freedom that serves a particular political or perhaps class agenda. So, for example, in Iran, since the Islamic Revolution of 1979, the two main rival political factions have been, on the one hand, conservative, religious, anti-imperialists who have more power, and liberal reformists. And the conservatives in power have really done their best to define freedom in terms of Iran as an independent nation, choosing its own fate, not being dependent upon or subservient to the United States or other great powers as it was before the revolution. And so freedom and national sovereignty are very closely defined in this definition, which conservatives are pushing for and kind of trying to naturalize. The liberals in Iran, by contrast, have defined freedom more in a way that stresses kind of individual people's freedom to do what they want without government interference. So liberals have pushed against rules enforcing modest clothing and Islamically proper hairstyles, for example, and restrictions on, for instance, women attending soccer games, right? Individual freedoms. These different definitions of freedom correspond to what the political thinker, mid-20th century political thinker, Isaiah Berlin called positive and negative freedom. And I'm going to put in an episode of a documentary down in the show notes that discusses these rival concepts of freedom, of liberty. But anyway, to return to the Iranian case, in this case, I think what's interesting about contemporary Iran is that what you really see is neither faction has succeeded in making their definition of freedom become the natural one. Neither faction, the conservatives or the liberals, have really achieved kind of this level of hegemony. So what you see if you talk to Iranians is that Iranian citizens are very much aware of kind of the multiple and politically interested meanings of the word. But if we compare Iran to the United States, in the United States, and I think this maybe is a bit outdated, this claim. This is maybe a bit more true in the 1980s and then the 1990s than it is today. But in the United States, I think that kind of the neoliberal political faction has actually had more success in naturalizing a definition, a meaning for the word freedom, the concept of freedom that's actually much more about the individual than about the group, much more about negative than positive liberty, right? So freedom, I think often in kind of a very naturalized way, in the way that Americans think about it, is the ability to do what you want as an individual without or with minimal government interference, right? Not the kind of national freedom from imperialist domination, or, for example, the Marxist version of freedom, which is the freedom from economic exploitation. And there are political implications to Americans largely adopting this definition, and with it kind of naturalizing not just a single meaning for the word freedom, but also the ideology that underlies that definition. So Americans are less willing to pay high taxes, for example, than citizens of other countries. They tend to be more hostile to big government, and to see government as threatening their freedom rather than as securing it. And of course, low taxes on the rich do serve a particular class interest, but that class interest gets hidden by the seemingly kind of universal and natural use of the term freedom to describe tax cuts for the rich. But of course, this kind of cultural hegemony isn't complete in the US either. Not everybody agrees that taxes should be super low for rich people in the United States. And I guess kind of the problem in trying to explain Hall's argument here is that there actually isn't really a way for me to provide a good example of naturalization, right? Because for us, for you and me, as members of roughly the same culture, which we probably are if you're able to make sense of what I've said so far, there's what if there's a conflict that's actually really successfully been covered up, a meaning that's been successfully naturalized, it's kind of by definition one that we're unaware of, that we've both internalized as being the common sense meaning of something. So I can't actually probably give you a really good example of a word with a naturalized meaning, because it wouldn't occur to me if it actually has been naturalized as being a word that's providing political cover for some political or class interest. There are lots of things that I'm saying and lots of images out there in the world that both you and I would interpret in the same way and not think twice about, but that, maybe people from a different part of the world, or maybe people 100 years from now, or 100 years before now, would have been able to point to and say, wow, Noah's really brainwashed about this or that issue. He didn't even recognize the politics behind the words he used, or the logo on his clothes, or whatever it might be. But what Hall kind of wants us to do, as much as we possibly can, is always think critically, always try to unpack and discover the hidden stories and the hidden power struggles behind the images that are flashing in front of our eyes every day.